Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. For those of you who would like to ask our speaker and moderator questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Stopping the Violence at the Source, Mexico's Lawsuit Against U.S. Gun Manufacturers. To introduce this topic, I would like to introduce the Consul General of Mexico, Ambassador Marcela Celorio.
Thank you, Kim. Good morning to you all. Allow me to thank our ally, Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall for hosting this important talk. Dear Alejandro and Professor Diamond, it is a pleasure to share the screen with you. As a lawyer, and I am sure Alejandro and Professor Diamond will agree, the rule of law cannot be highlighted enough. The pacific settlement of disputes by a court of law is a fundamental value of any modern democratic society. Mexico believes that controversies can and must be addressed at the legal arena, and that a solid legal argumentation contributes to the rule of law. This important case that Mexico has brought to the attention of a federal court in Massachusetts serves to generate public debate about gun violence and the importance to seek remedy through appropriate legal channels. From the consular perspective, boots on the ground, there is an issue that concerns us, both the Americans and Mexicans. We see every day the deep connection of guns and domestic violence. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, an abuser's access to a firearm increases the risk of a woman's murder by up to 1,000%. This is alarming, of course, but let me put it in perspective. Every 13 hours, an American woman is shot dead by an intimate partner. For these reasons, public debate about this topic is fundamental. I am sure Alejandro and Professor Diamond will have a very interesting conversation, and I am certain we all can benefit from it. Thank you very much.
Ambassador, thank you so much. You were so instrumental in helping us pull this program together, so thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Alejandro Celorio, who is the legal advisor of the Mexico Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He will be joined by moderator Raymond T, who is professor of law at Louisiana State University Law School. He's also the James Carville Alumni Professorship and with the Jules F. and Francis Landry Professorship. Thank you both so very much for joining us. Mr. Diamond, let me turn this over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I do want to say thank you very much for being able to join in this this conversation. So let me ask Mr. Celorio, and this is a somewhat open-ended question. Would you tell us why Mexico has filed this lawsuit?
Thank you very much, Professor Raymond, and thank you to Los Angeles World Affairs Council, Ambassador Celorio, for this opportunity to share this quite unusual approach to a topic that has been hurting Mexico and the region for decades. For the last 20 to 30 years, Mexico has been experiencing a situation of armed violence in Mexico, a growing situation of armed violence with the presence of criminal organizations that continuously have higher firepower. There's studies that talk about how criminal organizations in the world and in Mexico started using handguns, and then they resorted to some semi-automatic rifles. Nowadays, criminal organizations in Mexico are bearing Barrett rifles caliber 50. The bullet of that rifle is the size of a carrot. This rifle is a sniper rifle that has a reach of almost 1 mile, and it's a sniper rifle. This rifle, of course, can destroy a body, can destroy somebody's person, and can bring down helicopters and stop vehicles. For years, the government of Mexico has addressed the issue of armed violence by prosecuting and stopping criminals that bear arms in Mexico and commit crimes. The government of Mexico has partnered with neighboring governments, in particular with the government of the United States, to stop the flow of semi-automatic rifles, handguns, from the United States in a manner of illicit traffic of these weapons. We have resorted on multilateral agreements and instruments. We have resorted on diplomacy and political engagement to try to do more and stop the flow of guns into Mexico. Now, we haven't discussed what was the level of engagement of armed companies, gun manufacturers, and distributors. And in 2019, as a way of context, an individual bought AK-47 style weapon online. He bought it from a company in Florida. That gun was shipped to Dallas. The individual grabbed the weapon and ammunition, then drove 4 hours into El Paso, Texas, into a Walmart and shot people, 22 deceased and some others hurt, of Hispanic profile. This individual, animated by white and national supremacism, wanted to kill people. Secretary Abroad, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico, asked me as legal advisor, why don't we find, or let's find all the legal actions in addition to diplomatic engagement to stop this from happening again. And that's when we started exploring what we could do. The fact of the matter is that for years, we received almost 500,000 of weapons from the US in an illicit manner. 500,000 of weapons are illicitly trafficked from the US into Mexico. There has been a dramatic increase in guns trafficked illicitly to Mexico and a dramatic increase in Mexico of homicides by gunfire since 2004. In 2004, there's two events around 2004 and 2005. 2004 is the repeal of the assault weapons ban in the United States, and 2005 is the enactment of a statute that provides certain immunity to gun manufacturers from civil liability. For the last 30 years, Mexico and the government of Mexico has tried to stop the flow of guns at the border with customs efforts, more personnel, more infrastructure. We combat illicit trafficking by prosecuting criminals, the consumers in Mexico. And now it's time, and that's why we're suing, to hold the companies accountable. We want to go to the source. And this lawsuit works in parallel to other diplomatic engagements at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral level with our governmental counterparts. And the conclusion of why we're doing it is because it's time that gun manufacturers, together with governments and particulars in both our countries, share their responsibility and do something to stop this that is hurting everybody. There's at least 1 million Americans in Mexico that suffer just as any Mexicans from the gun violence produced by the illicit traffic of these guns that is facilitated, that's what we allege in our complaint, facilitated by the negligent and illicit commercial practices of the companies we're suing.
Well, I think what you point out is that there is a problem in Mexico with firearms, and that the problem has its origins in the United States because so many of these weapons are imported illegally. They're smuggled into Mexico. This represents, I would suggest, a national security problem both for Mexico and the United States. So part of the question, I think, has to be, quite aside from the lawsuit, and I do want to return to that, but quite aside from the lawsuit, it's about the diplomatic engagement between Mexico and the United States. What have the two countries together been able to achieve? And what more is there to achieve, both in terms of law enforcement as the two countries join together, and in terms of other efforts that you may want to see?
Thank you for that question, Professor. Let me share. I'm a career diplomat, just like Ambassador Celorio, and I've been engaged in a lot of conversations with our counterparts and friends, American friends, the U.S. government, and the conversations are very interesting when we try to explain what happens in Mexico, and they know. But when we say in Mexico, we only have one store managed by the Mexican Army where individuals can buy guns. And then we ask our American counterparts, how many gun stores are in the US? Or registered firearm federal licensees. And then the other interesting question, you know, this is the ice-breaking conversation, is how many of those gun stores are located within the first 20 miles of the Mexico-US border? And then we start talking about there's a growing consumer market in Mexico of individuals that shouldn't have guns and these kind of weapons. And they resort on the wide availability of weapons of that sort into the United States. So then the question is, what can we do together? As a government, Mexico would never attempt to question or challenge or criticize domestic law of any other sovereign country. But what we can ask is, how can we work together? Because the whole system and environment of gun trade in the US is affecting Mexico. So what is that we're doing and we can do more? First of all is to find the consumers in both sides of the border. There's individuals that buy weapons in gun stores. These are straw purchasers. It's people that buy for somebody else. There's individuals that do multiple buys. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 rifles in the same purchase. There's individuals that have criminal records and are buying guns in the United States. So they need to be found and prosecuted at the source in the United States. They can be found, they should be found and prosecuted in Mexico at the time of use or exchange with a criminal organization. We share a lot of information. That's what we can do within our territory, and we're doing. We also do at the border. A lot of attention has been put into what we can do in terms of customs. And one quick answer to what customs is not the answer, we're talking about an illicit traffic. By the nature of the traffic, the product wants to be crossed unseen. So unless we build a wall at the border, these weapons are going to continue crossing, either as a product hidden somewhere or disassembled and by parts to be assembled again in Mexican territory. Putting all US and Mexican governmental efforts into trying to stop the flow at the border is just a matter of distracting our efforts. So, but nevertheless, we continue doing. How we can do, what are we doing? Some mirroring patrol, so we can share our efforts. We have a very long border. Not the US, not Mexico can control very tightly or as tightly as we would want. The border is too big and in areas that are very hard, like deserts. So we share information, we do mirroring patrolling, we share information on where are the guns bought and what are the routes. Both governments know, just as the gun manufacturers and distributors, where their guns are being distributed and sold and then found in Mexico. This is an e-tracing system or traceability information through the serial number of the weapons. Now, what else can we do? We should do together, both countries, Mexicans living in the US and Americans living in Mexico. we should talk about the illicit traffic of guns. That is not okay. I believe that's a value that we share as countries. The illicit traffic of guns and the use of weapons to commit crimes, to kill, to hurt, to kidnap, that's not a value that we share. What we share is that if there has to be a trade of guns, it has to be transparent, responsible, and with accountability. And that's where we are. Let me just finish this answer, Professor Diamond. There's a new engagement between the US and Mexican governments. It's the engagement Bicentenario, honoring the 200th year of diplomatic relations with the United States. We share information, we share our concerns, we're working together in terms of what is that we want to find. Some Mexican agents will go to the United States to work on illicit traffic of guns, gathering more information, understanding best the system. We're going to reinforce our traceability capacities, our ballistic analysis. There's a lot that we will continue doing as governments. And as I said at the beginning, if the governments are putting so much effort and so much of taxpayers' money into stopping the illicit traffic of guns, I think the companies should do some also to help governmental efforts that we're doing already.
Well, thank you for that answer. I do take it that both nations are laboring mightily to stop this illicit arms trade across the border. And of course, that arms trade is in turn a function of narcotics gangs in Mexico that are producing drugs and they're selling them to the United States, where we have people who demand those drugs. This is a problem for both of our countries. And the larger part of the problem is that we have not been effective at ending this traffic. So one of the devices that that Mexico has undertaken is this lawsuit against the many gun manufacturers in the country, and as I recall it, one arms distributor. And so I suppose my question is, why is Mexico suing these defendants in the United States and not in Mexico?
As I mentioned, the lawsuit is just another action in this broader strategy to stop armed violence in Mexico produced by the illicit traffic of guns. And is part of our strategy in the sense that we know that any defendant would question, why are we suing them in Mexico if they don't do business in Mexico? As I mentioned, there's only one store in Mexico. So the companies don't have, as far as I know, headquarters in Mexico City. They don't do trade. They don't promote their guns in Mexico City, even though the websites can be accessed from Mexico, but they don't promote here. So what we first question, why suing in the United States and not in Mexico? We wanted to give them a fair chance to defend themselves in their language, in their legal system, close to their headquarters, and with all the arguments and defenses that they could present. In Mexico, they don't join of any immunity against lawsuits. And we wanted to give them their fair chance on their day in court to defend themselves against our lawsuit. And in addition to that, it's also a matter of procedure. Suing them in Mexico, in federal court in Mexico, would have meant that we would have to resort in some international instrument to serve notice. If they didn't comply with that notice, or they didn't present themselves into the court, perhaps we would have gotten a judgment in absence. And then to enforce that judgment in the United States would have been very challenging, and not the economic compensation that is included in our lawsuit, but the self-policing, the change of their protocols, the important things that we're asking in the lawsuit. it would have been very difficult to enforce because we would have had to ask federal U.S. federal court to enforce a Mexican federal judgment, and I think that would be a lot more complicated than what we're doing, suing them in the U.S. where they have when there's personal jurisdiction over them in the court in Boston.
Well, you've said the magic words that that all first-year law students in the United States fear. It's personal jurisdiction, and I think that if there are problems, as you have related it, with personal jurisdiction, because gun manufacturers and distributors have no personal footprint in Mexico, I think that leads to the next question, and that is whether the Mexican government can establish or would be able to establish proximate cause. If there's no personal footprint, if there's no business footprint, there's no purposeful availing of the territory of Mexico in the business of these defendants, then don't you have a very difficult time establishing that the actions of these defendants lead inexorably to damage within Mexico?
Yeah. I believe that in U.S. law, but certainly in Mexican law, when we talk about negligence, our tort law, our civil law, when there's foreseeability that an injury would occur, there's no need to prove knowledge or a very tight link between the conduct and the injury. Now, the argument that we make, I'll make a general presentation. The argument that we make is that the companies we're suing are on notice that their products are in Mexico first. Second, that their products are used by people that shouldn't have access to those products, because in Mexico we don't have a legal market of that kind of weapons. Third, that their products are being used to commit crimes, illicits. Now, the first argument that we present is that even though they are on notice, not only because of the media reports or the YouTube videos, these criminal organizations, if you haven't seen them, I invite the audience to look into that. They have videos in YouTube, uploaded in YouTube, presenting their firepower, and they're showing the R-15s, the Barretts, the AK-47s, and others. There's governmental reports telling the companies that their weapons are in Mexico. There's traceability information, as I said, e-trace information that is available to the companies, that their weapons appear in Mexico. And even though they know or should know that their product is misused, used to commit crimes in Mexico, they fail to change their trade practices, and they fail to sanction and monitor their distribution chain. Now, the defendants claim that not only the geographical distance between Massachusetts and Mexico, they don't say it like this, but in a way, that's how I understand it, but it's not only the geographical distance, but also the intervention of other actors, including criminals, in the line between conduct and injury. But I don't believe that it exists a precedent that helps to escape liability depending of the actors involved in between the conduct and the injury. Our complaint argues that their negligent practices, that even though they are on notice that their negligent practices produce this injury, they haven't made any changes. So it's going to be interesting to present our response on January 31st, because in part of our arguments, we are resorting on the legal principle, I believe recognized by the US law doctrine, but certainly in Mexico and US law, and also in transboundary tort law, that the substantive law that applies is the law of the place of injury. In this case, the injury happens in Mexico. In Mexico, there's liability for individuals that manage dangerous products just by no foreseeing or failing to foresee the injury that could happen or could occur by the wrong use of that product. They are liable under civil law. So our argument to the U.S. federal court in Boston is that as a matter of choice of law, Chief Judge Celorio should look into Mexican civil law and recognize that there's liability for these gun manufacturers for the injuries that have been produced in Mexico.
Well, I appreciate that answer, and what I take from that answer is that the position of Mexico is that A, Mexican law applies, B, that some of the principles of approximate law, or rather approximate cause, that we may be used to in the United States obtain differently in Mexico. And that under that theory, the gun manufacturers and the gun distributor are liable. But that will only be the case if the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act does not apply. Now, the LPCAA bars any qualified civil liability action from being brought in any federal or state court against any manufacturer or seller of a firearm based on harms resulting from the criminal or unlawful conduct of a third party. Now, I would suggest, and I'm sure that the defendants in this case will suggest, that the PLCA really hits this lawsuit where it lives. And I would suggest that this is a bar that this lawsuit is going to have to overcome. And how would you, what is the answer to that? What is the answer to that?
It's going back to the diplomacy and efforts. Again, just as the government of Mexico respects and honors foreign law, we should also, and we also ask for other laws not to impose an obligation into our sovereignty and our territory. I'll explain myself. A US law or any foreign law, as a general rule of international law, is conceived to apply within the jurisdiction of that country. There are some examples of extraterritorial effects of domestic laws. Mexico has a disposition in its criminal code that talks that there's extraterritorial jurisdiction over acts, criminal acts committed by a Mexican national abroad or by foreigners against Mexican nationals abroad. That's an example of an extraterritorial effect of a statute. There's some statutes in the US, the recently passed Zapata and Aviles statute that offers extraterritorial jurisdiction to US courts over criminal acts against US agents posted abroad. Now, the question here is, if the PLCAA as a federal statute applies in Mexico in a sense that offers immunity for injuries occurred in Mexico. So in a way, we would have to ask ourselves, is that the case? The case that a federal US statute will impose Mexico an immunity to US companies for injury occur, for civil liability against them for injuries that happen in Mexican territory? And I think that's an interesting question for Judge Saylor to look into that. What is the test, the two-pronged test into the presumption against extraterritoriality of a statute? Does the PLCAA says clearly and openly that it offers immunity against civil liability for injuries that could happen anywhere in the world? Our reading of the statute is that no, there's no express statement that provides extraterritoriality to the PLCAA. Then we have to look into the focus of the statute. What are we talking about, the immunity? And we go back to the legal systems. The PLCAA and the discussions around the enactment of this statute is looking into the US legal system where there's legal trade of guns, weapons, even if they're military style, into the US, in the US among private citizens. That statute is looking into offering immunity against civil liability for the misuse of that product. Our reading is in the US, because in Mexico there's no legal trade, and because there's no legal trade, there's no need for a statute that offers immunity against civil liability. So it's going to be very interesting for us, certainly, but I'm sure for all interested in this litigation, about what is the scope and the extent of PLCAA beyond US jurisdiction. And again, I end by saying that with all respect we have for domestic foreign law, we also claim that that statute doesn't apply for injuries that happen in Mexico. It's going to be interesting, the discussion around choice of law. Again, there's no PLCAA in Mexico, and about the presumption against the extraterritoriality of PLCAA and the immunities it offers to these gun manufacturers in the United States.
Well, I think if the defendants are able to make the PLCAA argument, and that is that no federal court nor any state court can take this case on, and if there is no personal jurisdiction in Mexico, then this is a situation which puts the lie to the oft-stated presumption that for every right there is a remedy. Now, again, I'm not saying anything that you don't know. I know that you have 2 Masters of Laws degrees in the United States. Chief Justice Marshall said many years ago that it's not true that for every right there is a remedy. This might be one of those rights. That is the right to be free from the damage caused by your neighbor. This might be a right for which there is no remedy. So I think that there are answers to that for the future, if that's the direction that we go in. And I think part of the answer has to be diplomatic engagement, further diplomatic engagement with the United States. I think it may have to be, and I claim no expertise as to Mexican law, but it may involve different substantive laws with respect to firearms and liability for causing damages with firearms, and it may involve different laws here in the United States. So I don't want to ask you to presume that Mexico loses this lawsuit at this procedural stage, but what if Mexico loses at this procedural stage where it is right now? What if this case gets dismissed because of the PLCAA? Where do we go from here?
Well, the first thing we'll do is to appeal. we would appeal because we feel very strong about our legal arguments. So the appeal will continue. But taking what you said, Professor, this litigation, as important and the many hours that has taken from our sleep, it's a very basic action. It's a tort lawsuit where we say your actions and omissions causes us an injury. It's just one component of a broader strategy of the government of Mexico and our engagement bilaterally, regionally, and multilateral to stop gun violence. Now, this litigation won't solve the problem of gun violence. Sadly, winning this litigation won't bring to life the hundreds of thousands of people that have died in Mexico. But what it will do is to address an angle that hadn't been addressed, that we're talking about business responsibility. So I'm a litigant, I have litigated before. I don't litigate to lose, but I'm aware that now it all depends on the court, and we respect the US court and the US system, and we will resort to all resources we have to try to prevail. Now, depending on the situation, the other actions will continue. So our bilateral engagement with the US government will continue. Our plea to the Security Council and the United Nations will continue. Our invitation to the US government to join the Inter-American Convention Against Firearm and Ammunition Trafficking, CIFTA, will continue. We will continue because this, not only we have the legal obligation, we have the moral obligation, and people are dying in Mexico. So we will continue. Now, there's some comments of people saying, you won, Mexico already won by presenting the lawsuit. We will win when we get the judgment. Now, what it is happening is this, the opportunity to engage with Americans, Mexican Americans, and Mexicans in the United States, and to talk about we're in this together. Armed violence is hurting us. Armed violence is causing mass migration, irregular flows, displacement. Armed violence is taking away our right to have a normal life, our right to life. So this lawsuit will continue and will happen what has to happen. But the additional elements that are already happening, I think that is worth noticing. And eventually, people that make laws, perhaps things in Mexico, we need to change laws, as you mentioned, or the Pope makes a call that we need to look into business responsibility. There's an emerging body of non-binding norms regarding businesses and human rights. We talk about gender and armed violence. I think the conversation around armed violence perhaps will call the attention of the businesses and say, there's something that we can do. If we are good faith businesses, let's put our minds and our energy and our money to prevent armed violence and to prevent the illicit traffic of their products.
Well, that is a good note on which to call on Jessica Duganzik to present the questions that we have from the audience. Jessica?
Thank you so much, Professor Diamond, and Mr. Celorio. Thank you so much for joining us for today's very important discussion. Before we go to the audience questions, I just want to remind our viewers that we are in the end of our year giving campaign, which helps us to end the year strong and continue hosting important programs like this in 2022 and beyond. I will put a link to where you can donate in the chat to support the council, and we appreciate any gifts you can make to support us. You can also visit our website and donate there at lawacth.org, and we thank you for anything that you can do. All right, Mr. Celorio, so this lawsuit claims the US gun companies undermined Mexico's strict gun laws by designing, marketing, and distributing military-style assault weapons in ways they knew would arm drug cartels, fueling murders, extortions, and kidnappings. The US exports guns all over the world and also uses them to kill our own citizens. Does Mexico really believe this lawsuit will put a dent in distribution?
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you for the question. We're not looking into stopping the trade of guns. That is not the purpose. Of course, First of all, because we respect US domestic law and the social contract that exists in the US. If the US wants to allow, or the US society allows the legal trade of guns, even military-style guns amongst their private citizens, that's okay for Americans. Now, our social contract in Mexico and our legal framework states that it is very, very difficult to have a weapon in Mexico legally. Only the armed forces import weapons and distribute it to the security forces. For a private citizen to get a weapon, they have to go through a whole procedure in that office that I mentioned in Mexico City, managed by the Army, and the caliber is very reduced. There's no semi-automatic weapons, there's no Barrett 50, there's no AK 47. It's very limited because we are, our nature and our social contract and our laws state, as the strict gun laws, that there's no trade of guns among particulars. We don't have in Mexico a right, Second Amendment right to bear and possess guns. There's a right to possess guns at your home. That's okay, but you need to have a license to do that. Now, it's interesting to talk about the legal trade of weapons into Mexico and into other governments. And this is, I think, is the best way that we can explain what gun manufacturers could do. On the wholesale of weapons, we're talking about the big containers and the shipments of rifles to governments all around the world. There's strict regulations to monitor and to sanction if those weapons get diverted and are used in crimes or to violate human rights. The Senate of the US is very strict in sanctioning those companies or calling the attention of those companies that are making business with human rights violators or criminals. Now, if the company is already engaging in a procedure and mechanisms to prevent the wrong use of their product, we're talking about the same companies, not only the ones we're suing, but in general, gun manufacturers in the world. Why not doing the same to prevent the illicit traffic of their weapons sold in retail? I think it's a no-brainer. Money, experience, willingness to prevent that their product and their prestige, I mean, they're good faith companies and their prestige, they don't want to be seen as the ones facilitated the commission of crimes and violations of human rights.
Thank you. This questioner says, I often cross the border at San Diego. I've always wondered why Mexico does not have a device like the US used to use for detecting the 500,000 weapons that enter Mexico each year.
We would like to have that kind of devices, but we are the 14th economy in the world. We are a big country in terms of population and culture, but with limited resources. And to put the taxpayers' money to stop the gun trafficking of weapons coming from the US would mean distracting or putting more money, let's put it that way, putting more money. That would mean distracting taxpayers' money and efforts and capacities from the flow of irregular migration that in a way is generated by the appetite from low-skilled workers in the United States. So there's, in average, 200, 250,000 people crossing irregularly in Mexico. We need to stop the illicit traffic of illegal substances. We need to stop also money coming from the US from the sale of these illicit substances. Yes, we would like to have more infrastructure. We would like to see more infrastructure from the CBP, Customs and Border Protection, at the border. We would like to see more efforts to stop the trafficking, but we have limited resources and we are bound to the good use of taxpayers' money. That's why we're asking the companies in a different way and this lawsuit, let's do something at the source. The companies, the businesses we're suing, and in general, gun manufacturers and distributors know and could help to stop the illicit traffic of their product by sanctioning and monitoring their distribution chain, for an example.
Does Mexico think the US government could do more to control the southbound flow of arms? And I saw that recently your president was meeting with President Biden, and they were discussing some options to address the violence. So maybe you could comment on that as well.
Certainly. There's a lot that we can do together. I would say more enforcement, not only at the border, but perhaps on the highways towards the border. It's interesting to see the checkpoints to stop the regular flow of substances and people. Perhaps the same energy that is put by the US government to stop the flow of guns and of people and substances to be put to stop the flow of irregular. This in a way is the illegal export of US products. If we look at it into that way, because the challenge is, how can you stop a vehicle of law-abiding US citizens under the presumption that they're trafficking guns into Mexico? But what about stopping them from illegally exporting a US product? That's something for the US government to think about.
Putting on your legal cap, would you advise the United States to sue China for importing fentanyl, which causes death to US citizens?
Thank you for that question. I think this is the future, and I got excited for the questions. This is the future of transboundary tort. So when we talk about international law, we immediately think of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court and arbitration. But when we talk about the conduct of private entities, we cannot take the gun manufacturers to the ICJ or to the ICC. Or to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So we're talking about transboundary litigation. So let's do it in the US because that's the forum that is more convenient for certain claims. Let's do it in Mexico. Let's do it in China. This is the future of international law. And I invite the audience, if we have interested in international law, this is a reality. Like I believe hearings with Zoom, I mean, you're suing in China, a Chinese company for a tort that you believe was offered to you, well, perhaps you can do it. There's a whole new universe for transboundary tort law and international litigation.
And as a follow-up to that, a lot of the drugs come through Latin America into the United States through Mexico. So in exchange, should the United States be suing Mexico regarding the drug smuggling, or is there maybe something that can be done with the lawsuit that you guys have going to try to address this cross-border import and export of things that neither of our citizens want?
Yeah, certainly. We don't want that. The basic of the lawsuit is we're not suing the US government for failing to regulate their trade. That there's no standing for that. There's no that wouldn't fly in US court. We're suing private entities for their negligence. It's a tort law. Now, the difference between the illicit trafficking of guns and drugs in Mexico is that these companies are conducting a legal business in general. Drugs are not legal in Mexico. Now, to think about this litigation regarding drugs in Mexico, Mexico would have to legalize the trade of drugs in Mexico. And then you could sue Alejandro Celorio for not monitoring and sanctioning my line of distribution of marijuana towards San Diego. Then we could have a similar lawsuit. But as the way things stand, guns are traded legally in Mexico. And there's a duty for gun manufacturers to take care of the way they conduct businesses. Drugs are not legal in Mexico. Whomever trades with drugs should be prosecuted under criminal law, not under tort law.
What about ghost guns with no serial numbers?
Ghost guns need some parts, spare parts that are produced by these same gun manufacturers. And the emergence of ghost guns, we believe, need the effort of governments and gun manufacturers and distributors into all putting our energies and resources in a way to figure out the best way to trace these guns that are not traceable because of the serial number. So we certainly, not here in the legal advisor's office, we don't have the technology or the imagination of how to stop these ghost guns. But what we believe is that what we can do is to stop or reduce the emerging consumer market in Mexico. Now, why would somebody need a ghost gun in Mexico? First of all, because they cannot get them legally. Second of all, is because they want to use it against somebody else. And that somebody else perhaps has a Barrett. So we would imagine if there's less guns in Mexico, there would be need for less guns to be illicitly trafficked or ghost guns. So what we have now in Mexico is a race, an armed race among criminal organizations that want to have higher firepower. Let me give you just an element. Drug organizations or cartels use handguns. Now somebody brought semi-automatic weapons. Somebody's brought the Barrett. Now is the gun of preference. Now there's man-made or handcrafted vehicles that are shielded. They're called La Bestia or the Beast. These are tanks that roam around certain areas in Mexico, and those tanks cannot be penetrated by a regular bullet. By the Barrett they can. But now what is happening? To combat or to respond to these tanks, now some criminal organizations are using drones to drop hand grenades. So you see, there's some spiral. It's going up, up, up. So what we need to do is down, less firepower, less firepower. I often think about the police forces in London, the Tommies, I think they're known. They only have a baton. They don't have a gun because they don't need to respond. That's what we want in Mexico, our social contract with only one store that sells guns. We want to get back our social contract where people shouldn't carry semi-automatic rifles. No?
Can you comment on the fact that gun manufacturers and gun advocacy groups lobby politicians to limit regulations and restrictions on the purchase of arms?
It's probably the hardest question in my diplomatic career. We've been in the response that defendants talk about Mexico being corrupt, and that hurts deeply because people that have died because of these guns cannot defend themselves. So you don't say you're corrupt just in a way of saying dismissing and hurting the moral character or trying to hurt the moral character of the plaintiff. But let's talk about corruption. And then we can talk about lobbying. And then we talk about money into unions, law enforcement unions in the US. That's a conversation that is not worth having in this litigation. Should be had in other circles among private citizens. What I believe our life and regular security shouldn't be kidnapped by money.
What does accountability look like? Oh, go ahead.
If I may add something there, we have a First Amendment right in the United States that is often not spoken of, but it's very important. It's the right to petition government for redress of grievances. And we have a right, therefore, to lobby our legislatures, including our Congress. Gun manufacturers have been extraordinarily successful in doing that, and that is part of why we have the PLCAA, which certainly is an attempt to protect gun manufacturers from liability in cases like this. That's not corruption, but it is lobbying. And for those who think that the PLCAA is a bad idea, I think the answer is, under the American system, to lobby Congress and to vote for members of Congress of our choice, so that if that is what we want, we can change the PLCAA. But as it stands right now, yes, gun manufacturers do have extraordinary influence over the United States Congress, and that is part of our system.
Thank you. What does accountability look like for the U.S. gun companies in this case, should Mexico win the lawsuit?
Well, what we are asking the court is, first of all, that these companies stop their practices, their negligent practices. For example, is the marketing, the way they conduct marketing in producing guns that appeal to drug cartels. If you have a gun that says Jefe de Jefes, and then is found in crime scenes in Mexico, it's clear that they make some marketing and production decisions based on a consumer that is not, or perhaps is not in the US. They need to stop that. We are asking them also, again, to put their energy and efforts and money into figuring out a device to prevent the illicit traffic of guns. We've been discussing, and that's something that will be part of the litigation and the discussion with our counterparts. If a car cannot be used unless you have the key, the electronic key, why not a semi-automatic rifle be used if you have the key? And I'm just saying it this out loud, but there should be some technology that allows the legal use of a product, but restrain it to the legal buyer. If I buy a gun for my son that is 14, saying that is for me, but then I pass it to him and that my son shoots me, that could have been prevented if you put some kind of technology. So I can only use it, or my son, when he's 18, he can buy it. So that's a second part of it. A third part of what we're asking the court is, there's good money in the trade, the retail and the wholesale of weapons. Perhaps that money should be used into campaigns to prevent the illicit traffic of weapons, to sensibilize and make people more aware of the danger that this weapon presents if it's in hands of somebody without the mental maturity, the training, or the interest of good to good. I mean, if somebody buys a weapon to hunt deer, they should use it to hunt deer, not to kill Mexican soldiers. And the third component is, and is part of our complaint, but it is not the main purpose. We're asking for an economic compensation. We present in our complaint that the damage suffered would is in the order of the 6% of Mexico's GDP. We're talking about tens of thousands of millions of dollars. And it's not that Mexico is looking to get that money just to get the money, but it's a way first of illustrating how hard and how deep it is and how important it is the damage suffered by these negligent practices. But it's also a way of making this issue more appealing to gun companies. These gun companies or gun manufacturers are on notice, as I mentioned in my presentation, of what happens with the product for decades. And they seem not to be influenced by this information. Perhaps they can be influenced when they face a judgment of this amount of money.
Makes sense. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I know that hour went by really quickly, but we appreciate you sharing your insight on this. And we wish you all the best at this lawsuit to make things safer on both sides of the border. So thank you again, Mr. Celorio and Professor Diamond. Thank you for leading today's conversation. I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, our time has come to an end. I think that this has been, and I do mean to undertake upon here, a high caliber discussion. But it is no pun to say that the caliber of this discussion has been high. It's been an opportunity, I think, for all of us to learn just a bit more about the diplomatic engagement that Mexico has undertaken with the United States on this matter. It's been an opportunity for us to learn more about the Mexican government's concerns with this very, very important issue. Mr. Celorio, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thanks to you. Thanks to all.
Thank you both. I just echo, we have been so well informed, and we appreciate your time and your expertise today. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and hopefully we will have a much greater audience learning from today's discussion. Thank you both so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.